thanks for coming, everybody. Please go ahead and go get pizza and something to drink if you haven't yet. We still have plenty. I think we have more on the way, don't we, Justin? Do we have more on the way? Yeah, I think we have more on the way. So, by all means, take as much as you'd like. Thanks for coming tonight. Tonight we have a very pertinent issue. I know we passed the debt ceiling bill last night and we have averted the catastrophe, but we just happened to kick the can down the road a little bit. We have the same exact situation that's going to occur at the beginning of next year. So, still a very pertinent issue, and we have some great professors here to walk us through the issues here. So, for those of you unfamiliar with what has transpired here. This is kind of what both sides wanted. The Republicans were after they wanted to defund Obamacare and they wanted to reform entitlements towards the end of the negotiations. The Democrats wanted what they called a clean bill. They were not willing to negotiate on these two things over the debt ceiling or government shutdown talks. And here's what they got with the bill: income verification in the Affordable Care Act. And then they kept the sequestration spending cap at that level. And then the Budget Supercommittee 2.0, as I've deemed it, which is a couple years ago in 2011, one of the agreements with the debt ceiling agreement then was that they'd form a bipartisan supercommittee to talk about potential solutions to the budget woes of the country. And they did pretty much the exact same thing here. And in December, they will be proposing potential solutions to the issue, which the past supercommittee did not do, so not promising on that one. And then here's what I was talking about at the beginning. So December 13th, that's the day that the supercommittee will give their suggestions. That's their deadline. And then January 15th, I don't know why that circle didn't appear, but that is the day that the next government shutdown deadline. And then February 7th is the next deadline for the debt ceiling. So all this did was move this back just a couple months, and hopefully we get a little bit better at dealing with these looming crises, though. So what the supercommittee is going to deal with is our budgetary woes, which are predominantly fueled by rising entitlement spending, and this is the big reason why. The baby boomers are getting old, they're starting to retire, and this has led to pretty skyrocketing costs in programs like Medicare, Social Security. So they'll try to find bipartisan ways to deal with these issues. And with that, we're gonna have some student coordinators interview our distinguished professors, Lewis Johnson and then we have Professor King from St. Cloud State as well. And we're very honored to have him. It's awesome that we get to work with St. Cloud State here. And we look forward to cooperating with them in the future. This is great. So first question I have for you two is, what in the heck is the debt ceiling?
There we go. Thank you. Let me just, before I answer your question, just add that I am really glad that you're here, King, today, because this is something that I've talked about with students and faculty over the years. Why don't we do more with St. Cloud State? So now that I'm in a position to maybe do that, I'm going to try and make that happen more. So I hope this is the first of many things that we can do together, especially with public policy, because there's so much we can do. The debt ceiling, in a sense, is an anachronism. It's something that was passed in 1917 in order to get the first large loan called the Liberty Loan during World War I. There was a lot of controversy about whether the United States should be entering World War I, a lot of controversy over whether war should be declared. Once it was declared, we had to find out a way to finance it. And one of the ways, as you know, in American politics is to get things through, you have to compromise. And so to get the first Liberty Loan through, the compromise involved putting a limit on how much debt the government could issue. There hadn't been any limit before that. So for example, when Lincoln was financing the Civil War, he didn't have to deal with a debt ceiling. He could just, the Treasury Department could just issue debt in whatever amount they needed. So, and actually Congress would have to authorize it, but there wasn't a ceiling. In a sense, you've got to wonder why we have it still. And I think the reason is that both political parties have found it useful to have this debt ceiling when push comes to shove. It's a nice thing to have every once in a while when you want to make a point. And so it really doesn't have any economic content, at least as far as I can tell. It's more a matter of political economy rather than economics.
So first of all, let me return the thanks to you all and to Louis for the opportunity to speak here tonight. Nice for St. Cloud to come out to St. John's. We do not have a pub of this kind on our campus. By state law, we're not allowed to serve alcohol on a regular basis on our campus. But in perhaps slightly less comfortable setting, Louis, I'd be delighted to have you come back and maybe we can do the same sort of thing at St. Cloud State next time. And again, grateful for the opportunity to come speak. I think Louis covers the main point. It's the Second Liberty Bond Act of 1917 that created the first debt ceiling. But you actually, if you want to think about it, have to go back a little bit earlier even than that and think about what happened during the Civil War. During the Civil War, we actually had debt. The Confederacy created debt as well. And there was a debate in Congress afterward about what do we do with that debt. Because we were at the same time we were going to have the debt come into the United States. We had this debt to pay off. We are also going to have Confederate senators and congresspeople from Confederate states, formerly Confederate states, who are now being reconstructed into the Union, come back. So in the discussion of the 14th Amendment, which plays a big role in this, and I'm not sure if we'll go that far or not, because I'm sure there are other questions to be asked here. There was a discussion about whether or not about how to treat the debt of the United States in terms of the Civil War, in terms of other debt, and the question of what do we do about the debt of the Confederacy, which is now being brought back into the United States. And so the 14th Amendment dealt with that, and at the end of the 14th Amendment, it says that the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Okay, it is considered that it has to be paid back. Number one, and then says right afterwards, and the debt of the Confederate of those who engaged in insurrection. The word insurrection appears in that amendment. Will not be paid back. You're getting nothing. Okay. So if you lent money to the Confederacy, too bad, you lose. If you lent money to the United States, and it's good for you. But in that conversation, they did more than just talk about war debt during that period. They actually were trying to speak to, in more general terms, pensioners who depend on that debt. And so I don't want to anticipate the questions you're going to ask, so I'm going to stop here and leave that question open. But the question being, what is the obligation of the United States to fulfill the obligations it has in extinguishing debt on behalf of pensions on the one hand? On the other hand, there was a lot of discussion at that time about the fact that a lot of the debt holders were New York banks, and there's been, if you study any U.S. history, you have to know that antipathy toward Wall Street is a long-standing tradition in American history, not something that's just come up in the last 5 years.
It's dangerous to bring up the Civil War because I wrote my dissertation on
I actually knew
Civil War and economic growth, and it's really funny. It's I hadn't thought of connecting it with that, but yeah, I mean that's a huge that's an issue that's still with us today.
Yeah,
and the other part of it, which again anticipating maybe one of your questions, is people talk about can you inflate away the debt. They had huge debates over that in Congress then, and they decided no, we are not going to inflate away the debt. We're going to make sure that all of this debt is paid back in gold, right, to guarantee that it was valuable. And so that's, in a sense, some of the debate we're having today is, should the Fed print money and just pay this debt or things like that. So, but I don't want to anticipate your questions.
All right, now coming from the other side of the table, my name is Jake, and I'm also student coordinator with some of the other members here. And I guess my question is, as many of you know, the U.S. federal government was within hours of not passing a bill to deal with the debt ceiling. And if the compromise that was reached was not reached, we most certainly would have defaulted. And what would that mean? What would the U.S. default mean?
Okay, I'll start with this, and and we're going to get along very well for the most part. This might be one of the places where we might not. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. First of all, this was called in the language in D.C. the X date. Today was the date that we were supposed to hit the debt ceiling. Now the Treasury, which is responsible for servicing the debt, still has $35 billion in cash if we went into today and could not borrow any more. Okay, so you got 35 billion. You've got let's say about $3,500 in your bank account. You're spending $1,200 a day. You're taking in $1,000 a day. You could pay your bills for a little while, for a week or two. Okay, but the problem is, at some point, you run out of $3,500. Now, what do you got to do? Now you have to make a decision about, well, what do I pay? Okay, I have $1,200 in bills. I've got $1,000. Some of these bills I can't afford to pay. What am I going to pay? And so this gets to the question of prioritization, which the Treasury would have had to decide whether or not to do. But even if it had decided not to pay principal and interest on the debt at that time, there's one more and this is where I come back to the 14th Amendment, right? If the Treasury says that they are not going to pay the principal interest on the debt, the question is whether they're in violation of Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. But there's a second person involved, right? Because the bills get actually presented to the Federal Reserve, who manages, the Federal Reserve's role is, in fact, to manage the fiscal affairs of the U.S. government, among other things, but that's one of their jobs. And if they had refused to pay the debt when it came due, if they were paid the bond and paid when it was due, they would have been in violation, I think, of the fourth section of the 14th Amendment. So if you do both, if they both act that way, something's going to the Supreme Court like that. Okay, we're going to go to the Supreme Court, and we're going to have a constitutional crisis. Now, what does that do in terms of default? I mean, we know there are costs involved, and we know this because as people will remember, we actually defaulted on our debt technically in 1979. We had this little episode where there was a computer glitch along with another one of these debt ceiling fights, and when they happened together, it turned out that for about a week and a half, there were 3 very short-term bonds that were not serviced, and about $100,000, or I think it was $100,000 of interest that didn't get paid. The problem with the, okay, so we were technically in default, and the research that I read on this, which was published 20 years ago done with econometrics in a way that most modern macro people would never do it this way now. But the way they did it suggested that it increased short-term interest rates by 60 basis points, 0.6%. That's where the cost is. If we actually have people believing that we might not pay back the debt, and if they believe that, then they will raise the interest they charge us to borrow money. And that has a significant cost, not just to the budget, but has a significant cost to a private business who's also got to borrow money in that same place, who now finds out that they now have borrowing costs 0.6% higher. And that would have actually caused some really serious issues in terms of where we go in terms of the economy. But those are long-run credibility issues. The short-run issues, I really think we would have ended up with a Supreme Court case that would have challenged Bush v. Gore in terms of its around the clock coverage on CNN and other cable news networks.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And the thing about the legal system is really important, because as soon as you've got, I mean, King and I know this, but you guys might not. As soon as you're starting to talk about any kind of financial asset like a bond, the lawyers are going to be involved. They're going to find ways to try and make sure that this gets paid, or that, you know, if you're even hinting at default, that the bondholders somehow get some percentage of the face value of it. So I was waiting for that too, that would have been very interesting to see what crowd of lawyers would have come up with what arguments, constitutional or statutory, to try and get some money out of this.
Do you have any pre-law students here?
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Okay. Bond law, okay,
Bond
many
law,
people
yep.
do it. There's a lot of money to be made.
Yep.
Yeah.
And there, and it's really, and it is quite, it can seem obscure, but it's really important because, for example, like, I don't know if you've heard about Argentina, what they've been going through. They defaulted on their debt in, what was it, 2000, 2001, even there. I mean, they're at the point where bondholders are trying to seize Argentine assets like naval vessels when they're in port and other countries in order to get some money back from the Argentine government. I don't think it would have come to that for the U.S. or anything, but as soon as you start even hinting at default, creditors get very, very nervous. And as King described it, that interest rate starts to creep up. And since the U.S. Treasury market is the basis for pretty much every other interest rate, it's in a sense a markup off that, every interest rate's going to go up.
Yeah, so you kind of hinted on the, the impact on the U.S. credit, and so if we were to default, what would be the consequences of a credit downgrade?
If we were to default,
If we were not.
Okay.
Well, I think.
Oh, just the credit rating downgrade. Well, the basic idea behind, I got to laugh because after what we've been through, why are we listening to the ratings agencies at all, right? When you think about it, I mean, they said that mortgage-backed securities were fine and these tranches were all safe and everything. We found out that they weren't. But the way that the bond markets work is, depending on what your credit rating is, that helps determine your interest rate. So that gets back to that thing of what's the interest rate going to be on U.S. government debt, and if it gets downgraded, that will put some upward pressure on those interest rates. But the bond market for U.S. Treasuries is so big, I just can't see the ratings agencies having that big an effect. Can you?
It's really large, and of course earlier this week, Fitch, which is one of the smaller, it's the smallest of the three rating agencies, put us on negative credit watch, and but they're the ones that still call us AAA, and so I kind of find it ironic. It seems like you're closing the barn door after the cows have all left, that's certainly. I mean, I think a credit downgrade would have some impact. Again, it does raise interest rates we talked about. Let me quantify it for you. I did the math out on that 60 basis point decline that was founded from the 79 and said, suppose that happened now. That comes out to a little over $100 billion if it affects every maturity of Treasury debt. That comes out to $100 billion per year. Not $100 billion overall. That's $100 billion per year, and there's no evidence in the paper that 60 basis point effect ever goes away.
I have one more econ question, and then we'll get into some more normative ones, and then we'll open it up to the students here. This is a request from Phil Cronenbush, who's a con law prof here. He asked, "What is the $1 trillion coin, and would this be a viable solution to a situation such as the one we were just in?"
The $1 trillion.
Can I say it's silly? Okay,
yes, please do.
I'm going to say it's silly, but let me explain. Right, we have two different places that appear to do the same sorts of things. We have the Federal Reserve, and we have the U.S. Treasury. Okay, the Constitution gives Congress the right to decide on coinage and on the standard of value for U.S. currency. The Federal Reserve has the right to issue notes, okay, and it does. However, coinage is still done by the Treasury. So the Treasury could still decide, if it wanted to take a $1 trillion coin. Here's the catch. In order to actually turn it into cash, they have to go to the Federal Reserve, right? So they have to go to the Federal Reserve with this coin and say, this is a $1 trillion coin. Give it. We're going to give it to you, and you're going to put it in the vault. And in return for that, you're going to give us $1 trillion worth of bank deposits that we can go spend. Why would the Federal Reserve accept that $1 trillion coin?
And it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of, what do you do with the $1 trillion? Pay off debt with it? It's still a liability of the United States government. If you did create it, it's just, okay, instead of having bonds as your liabilities, you now have this $1 trillion coin as a liability on the books. But it doesn't change the fundamental problem, which is you owe $1 trillion.
What it does change is that the $1 trillion coin pays no interest.
Yeah, but given that interest rates are so low right now.
Yeah, right. right.
You can issue debt at almost nothing.
How do you two think we should fix entitlements? And this is two areas.
Wow.
So you have like a magic wand. You have a magic wand. You're just like you're in charge of the world for a day, and you get to and you have to fix entitlements. What would you do?
No, you don't want that.
And there might be some disagreement here. But
First of all, the Red Sox would win the World Series. So
Well,
okay,
it's wins.
that take care of. Well, okay, I'm just king of the world. I'm not
Oh,
God.
that's right.
You know,
There's
you know,
only so much
I mean, miracles are reserved for certain people.
That's right.
Okay, how do you fix entitlements? I mean, it's such a broad question. I mean, first thing we have to do is, I mean, you showed a graph talking about the demographics, the aging of the U.S. population, and I think that's just a huge issue that we'll continue to face for a while. At some point, you have to start thinking about what to do about the age at which people retire, because in essence, what happened in 2008 changed that. I looked at my bank account in 2008 before the crash and said, "Gosh, I guess I could retire at 62 or 63. Gosh, wouldn't that be fun?" Okay, not true now. My 401k became a 201k, and after that, I looked at it and said, you know what? Maybe I will have to work till I'm 68, 69, or 70. Well, guess what? The other side of this is we have, and I don't think we've even gotten to the surface of the ability of us to use technology to increase lifespan. The fact that we can live a lot longer. But if we live a lot longer and we continue to expect that we can retire at age 65 and the government will send us a check every month, well, I don't think you need to get an econ degree to realize that just can't work. Okay, so if we're going to continue to have life extension technologies, and we will, because people want it, people want to live longer. Okay, I don't think they want to live forever, because forever is a really long time. But I think they want to live longer. You got to reconsider, why do we think we can all retire at 65? So something has to give on the age, and there just has to be an agreement that we're all going to go ahead and do that, so that Republicans, Democrats can sort of look at each other and say, you know what, we really just have to do that. And maybe that happens next month. I'm not holding my breath. Okay, but that has to happen, and to me that's the biggest issue. That is the Medicare and Social Security issues are the ones that we really have to think about. On the other side, we have to think about the fact that, and boy, I'll say something that people know that I was elected to the legislature, and I was on the Republican ticket when I did that. But I will say, the thought that we have to do something serious about considering what will we pay for people who are approaching the last 6 months of life. Someone has to have that conversation, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't allow somebody to charge that you're just appointing death panels. Well, nobody wants death panels, but we have to have a way to have a conversation so we can respect the individual decisions while saying, that one last surgery that's going to cost $40,000 and might extend your life for a week, we can't pay for that. Someone needs to have that conversation.
Yeah, you put your finger on the entitlement problem. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We could probably hammer out an agreement pretty quick, and it's not that big a problem. But basically, if you look at the difference between what we've promised as benefits and what we've promised to tax ourselves over infinity, like you said, forever is a long time, but discounting does chop a lot off at the end. We're talking a gap of about $211 trillion. So we've got about $211 trillion difference between what we've promised to ourselves and to our children and our children's children in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and all that stuff, minus what we're supposed to pay in taxes. We can't do that. I mean, it just doesn't add up. And so the question becomes one as much of politics as economics of, well, all right, what are the trade-offs you're willing to make in order to do that? And I was, back when the healthcare debate came along in 2009, I was just dismayed that we didn't have that conversation, because it should have been part of that. Instead, we got so involved in these other issues, but yet the fundamental thing is the end-of-life question, and what do we mean as a society by retirement? We didn't have the word retirement until the 1880s. It didn't exist in America except as retiring debt. But we had a revolution that happened after the Civil War in terms of what it meant to not work anymore. We used to have a situation where you would retire on the job. Okay, you worked in a factory or you worked at a manual labor, and then when you got to be in your 50s, maybe you went to a less difficult physically part of the work. And then when you got into your 60s, you maybe worked as a security guard or a janitor or something like that. But you kept working. You didn't stop. And I have a feeling the wheel's going to turn and we're going to come back to that. In a sense, that's the way we're going to get out of this problem, is we're going to come back to that kind of idea that, all right, you don't actually retire, but you shift gears. Maybe you go from teaching full-time to part-time, thinking of us. We don't have to actually teach full-time till we're 75, but well, maybe I will. But, but we'll downshift. And I actually think that's a good thing, because I don't want to get too philosophical, but this last weekend I visited my parents, spent time with them. I visited my daughter, who's a first-year student at the U, yesterday. And then before this, I went out to visit a friend at the cemetery. I like to go take a walk and talk to John Brandel, see his gravestone. His grave is there in St. John's Cemetery. And it made me think about this whole thing of how generations are linked together. And that needs to be part of the conversation, I would argue, that if we're going to try and come back to your question, fix entitlements, the bigger question is, what's the relationship we have and what are the obligations we have as a society towards each other?
Can I just stick one more quick thought on that, on this point? If we just say the answer is people are going to work longer, well, now how does that affect this generation, you? Because a lot of the jobs you'll get are the jobs that folks like Lewis, and I'm not sure how old Lewis is, but the folks that in my late 50s, am going to leave, and hope maybe in 10 years, you'll have your PhD by then. You'll be looking for a job teaching somewhere. If I don't retire, how do you get a job? So what kind of jobs will there be for you? So you may say, well, that question's important for guys like Lewis and King because they're approaching that age. It's not just for us. It's a topic that affects you as well. $17 trillion.
You mean the $17 trillion debt like we've got?
Yeah.
Sure. The question is, could we have imagined, was it 10 years ago? Could we have imagined 10 years ago having a debt of $17 trillion? I guess I could have. I could have imagined it. But I'm not trying to make light of it. I mean, I still remember, well, I'm 53 to answer your question. So,
okay.
So I'm old enough that I remember.
Yeah.
I remember in the early 80s we were, worrying about these giant numbers for deficits, and now we'd be thrilled to have deficits of those sizes. And so nothing surprises me much anymore about how big certain numbers can get. I just don't.
Yeah, my first time being even the slightest involved in politics was 1978. And I remember we were having conversations, and the candidate that I worked with, who lost badly, by the way, was out speaking harshly about a deficit that at that time was about $220 billion. Okay, and the debt at that time, I'm pretty sure, was less than $5 trillion. So that's So, but you ask, can I do it? Yeah, because of the miracle of compounding, I can figure out the fact that when GDP, we were at that time, if you think about 78, 79, 80, we were at debt to GDP ratios, near 70, 80%. And if you just look at the debt that's not held by the Fed, not held by Social Security and so on, just debt outside the banks, outside of government, you would be not too far away from that. So it is quite imaginable, in fact.
All right, I have one last question here, and it should be a quick one, then we'll open it up to questions out in the audience. I just kind of want to get your predictions on what will happen between now and the next debt ceiling deadline.
Christmas. It's on the 25th, right?
Yeah,
December.
yeah. Christmas, New Year's.
Christmas, New Year's.
Um,
Well, I could go first. Doesn't
Go ahead,
matter.
go
I mean,
ahead,
so
please.
they asked me this. I heard them over. I overheard their question, so I was thinking my answer. I have a feeling we're going to see something like Simpson Bowls, at least on paper. But that's what will this committee, the super committee to the Wrath of Khan, will come along with something that looks like Simpson Bowls, raise some taxes, cut some entitlements, change the retirement. But the question then is, what is it, on January 15th or so, or December 13th when they're supposed to come up with it? It'll land with a thud, and then how will House and Senate react? I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Super Committee 2.0 will really accomplish that Super Committee 1.0 didn't do. Simpson Bowles was a perfectly reasonable plan.
Yeah.
I mean, it had some tax increases. Yes, I agree. Okay. But in order to get a handle, I mean, for me, this debt is really important. I mean, the size of the debt is a very important issue for this country, and I think there are a lot of people who believe that. But if you think you can get there just by cutting discretionary spending, the math's all wrong. So you have to come to entitlements. Well, there are people who depend on those entitlements, and in the process of creating a compromise, you probably do have to move toward the other side a little bit. Now, there are ways to get revenue that don't involve in influencing tax rates and causing the things that many economists will tell you create disincentives for work, saving, and investing. There are other ways to get there. They're called deductions, and you start to look at them. But when you decide that we can't touch the deduction for state and local income taxes, you can't touch the home mortgage deduction, you can't touch the charitable contribution deduction, which, among other things, helps support this beautiful, beautiful campus you have. Okay, when you say you can't touch any of those, there isn't much left. It's just, I mean, it gets back to my favorite line: math is hard. Math is really hard, and and how you're going to get about this and doing it in ways that's just not going to cause any issues. It's not going to, everyone's concerned about the 17 trillion until you ask them, well, what are you going to do to help solve it? And they're like, oh, well, go get that guy first. And that's in fact what Simpson Bowles 1 was, and I think there'll be a Simpson Bowles 2, but I think I agree with Lewis. I'm pessimistic that it'll actually end up solving anything at all.
All right, so we've heard about the deficit, the debt, some entitlement stuff. I know some of this stuff went over my head. And the goal of Politics in a Pint, just so we kind of reiterated, is that everyone can kind of be on the same page and get to know the stuff that's going on in the current events. So if you need some clarification on something that the professors talked about, or you want to go dig deeper from what they said, that's what the Q&A time is for now. I saw Edwin had his hand up, so we'll start with him. And then if anyone else has a question, Jake has got the other mic, so we'll go around. And we've got about 20 minutes worth of questions.
Thank you. My question is, how has the shutdown affected our prestige with creditors such as China, who are the biggest foreign holders of U.S. debt?
Go ahead. He's got the cool infographic over there. I saw that one a couple weeks ago.
I was going to pass it
yeah,
around.
you should pass it around because it's really cool. But I mean, it's that old line, right? If I owe you $2,000, you own me. But if I owe you $2 million, I own you. The Chinese are stuck holding our debt because again, the reason we're able to do what we're doing is we are the reserve currency. We are the largest economy. We have the most debt outstanding. One thing that we didn't talk about is the impact of having our treasury bills become insecure on all kinds of credit that's issued where those treasury bills act as collateral. Well, in the same way, the debt which is actually on the asset side of the balance sheet for the People's Bank of China is our debt. And if they try to threaten us a little too much, they're reducing the value of their own assets. So in some sense, they could say something, but I hate to tell you, we're the only game they have in town. So they have to work with us. And so, I mean, I always took those threats as being, well, yeah, you can make some noise, but if you ever made some real noise, you'd be hurting yourself just as badly as you're hurting us.
Yeah, I mean, certainly they're mad. They don't like it. You don't ever want the country, the person who owes you money, you don't ever want to hear that they might not pay you back. That's never happy to hear. But King put his finger on something really important, which is the U.S. being the reserve currency means that we get to issue our debt in our own currency. We get to issue dollar-denominated bonds. That's incredibly useful to us because we can just print up dollars to pay them off if we really needed to. Now, there's all kinds of nasty consequences if we tried to do too much of that, but they can't do that in Greece. They can't just print euros to pay off their debt. And the Chinese can't print up RMBs to print off any of their debt. We can. And by making the debt less secure, that threatens our ability to do that, which again comes back to the point about interest rates. Maybe foreign creditors will say, well, geez, if they're going to do that, I might have to have a little bit more interest on this to do it.
Yeah, question on that.
Hi. What do you think is, like, let's say Christmas comes around and we basically end up facing the same exact government shutdown that we are right now. What do you think is the worst case scenario once, if they can't get things done again?
Okay, so I can go first. I'll go first on this one. Have I gone first too much? Okay.
Not at all. You're the guest.
Thank you. Okay, so last time, if you don't mind, I'll use a poker analogy. I like analogies, as you can tell. Okay, but this is like a poker analogy. All right? So you had two games going on. You had the game between John Boehner and Harry Reid. And when John Boehner found out, and then Harry Reid is also, and President Obama are also playing a game against the Senate minority, which because of the rules of the Senate, even though they're a minority, they've got some real power in terms of the filibuster and so on. Okay, so as long as I don't know what hand you have and you don't know what hand I have, I can do things to try to represent to you that I have a strong hand. What we learned this week is John Boehner no longer has a strong hand. He not only has rags, that's a slang term in poker for having bad cards underneath. He not only has rags, he's having to play his rags face up. Everybody knows. And guess what? When the cards get dealt again, he'll still have those same two lousy cards he had last time. And everybody will know it. So I don't think he can make a credible threat. And I actually don't think we'll be anywhere near as bad next time as we are this time, because I don't see where the Republican side gets more leverage in January and February than they had in October.
No, that's the way I saw it, because if you were going to do it, you would have had a filibuster this time in the Senate. You would have played that card and said, all right, I have a weak hand in the House, but I can always play the filibuster card and I could get 41. Do you need 40 or 41? I can never remember. 41 people, probably 41 Republicans to stop this deal. Well, what was it? 18 voted against. I mean, I just don't see that getting any stronger. Yeah.
Hi, my name's David. I'm a parent of a Johnny. I got a question for you.
Thank you.
Some of the students a moment ago talked about entitlements. Could you provide some examples? For example, is an aircraft carrier an entitlement versus funding for a Head Start program? I mean, when you mentioned what entitlements you may cut, that seems to be a buzzword going around lately with the GOP and the Democrats going back and forth on those. And then secondly, if I may, the sequester, will that happen again? Is that why they're not really agreeing to anything right now, so they could perhaps use that as a leverage card?
Well, take that one first. The sequester happened, and we've got it, and that's to me what one of the underreported, unreported stories of this whole thing is that if you'd have asked President Obama, will you accept a level of spending, what is it, 980 billion back in a year ago, he would have said, no way. No, that's way too low. Well, he agreed to it. Didn't even flinch. Said, sure. that's a heck of a, to me, that's quite a victory right there for, that if people who are advocating that level of spending, they got that. And if I were on that side of the argument, I'm not on either side. But if I was on that one trying to make it, I'd say, look, we got this. This is a really big victory. To get to your first part, though, this is where you might know this better than me, but what my understanding is that an entitlement, at least in budget speak, is any program that has continuous funding, so it doesn't have to be renewed from year to year, and people who can get that simply have to meet certain criterion, and therefore they get a payment. So for example, if you are 65 and over and an American citizen and have paid in Social Security taxes, you are entitled to receive Social Security. An aircraft carrier doesn't have that. There has to be a bill passed in Congress authorizing the spending on it, but I'm rusty on that. So
No, I think he has that right. Certainly the sequester was, and I'll do them in the same order Lewis did. The sequester was a big deal to the Senate Republicans, and I think the reason there were only 18 nays on the bill last night was because they had Leader McConnell went to his people in the caucus room and said, look, if I can keep the sequester in place, will you promise not to throw too big a fit? Okay, so Ted Cruz got up, spoke for like 5-6 minutes, sat down. I don't think Mike Lee got up at all, the fellow from Utah. That thing went lickety split, and I think it's because they got the sequester, which is important to them. Now to your first point, I think it's important to point out the reason the sequester comes from the Budget Control Act of 2011, which in fact was the last time we went through this fight over the debt, right? And the sequester was put in place as sort of the poison pill at the end of what became Simpson-Bowles 1. And the belief was that the cuts to the defense spending are so hideous that Republicans would never agree to them. And so they would be forced to come to the table, make a solution, and that would include more revenue, which is what President Obama wanted. Not only is the sequester still in place, quietly last spring, the sequester was topped up an extra $19 billion that all went on the defense side. So the defense side has been helped. Now, what happens in January is that there's a second round under the BCA of 2011. There's a second round of sequester cuts. And what I don't know, okay, I know there are lots of things I don't know, but one of the things I don't know is I don't know if that actually takes them back down to the old defense levels, or if that 19 billion rides permanently. And that's just because I haven't read the language of the bill yet. But I would think that $19 billion is going to be something that's in the news going forward.
I think so too.
Hi. Thank you both for being here and staying after for Professor Johnston. My question was about, I kind of wanted to take it back to the international sphere. We talked a lot about China buying our bonds and all that fun stuff. I kind of was unaware that other countries have massive debts as well. It makes complete sense. Once I learned about it, was looking at this nifty little chart put out by the UN, I was like, oh. But I was wondering if you could talk about that, about our role in the global economy of buying bonds from other countries, and the fact that, like you mentioned, Argentina, other countries have this problem, and we tend not to hear too much about it. And I was just wondering if you could both touch on that briefly.
Well, to me, one of the things that I'm an economic historian and a macroeconomist, and one of the things that got me most interested in economic history, actually, when I was an undergraduate, was when I started learning about how Argentina, bless you, defaulted pretty much every 15 years during the 19th century. They would default, and then the Europeans would loan them money again. Then they'd default, and they'd loan the money again, and they'd default, and they'd loan the money again. And I was like, why the heck are they doing that? Why would they do that? And it turns out that that's a feature of the international financial system going back hundreds of years. That you loan each other money, and you borrow not just from your own citizens, but you borrow from whoever's going to loan you the money. So if you're Britain and you're fighting a war with the Dutch, you may not like the French, but if they're going to offer you a loan, well, you're darn well going to take it. And if you're Argentina and you don't really like the Americans and what they're doing, but they offer better credit terms than the British, I'm going to borrow the money from the Americans. And so understanding how international financial markets work to me is at the center of understanding international relations. Because, and this is off topic, but one thing I've always found interesting is when you start having sanctions and things like that, it breaks those bonds and you lose that leverage.
Yeah,
so, you know, sanctions are a two-edged sword that way, but that's farther away from your question. I mean, your question's a really broad one, and I don't know quite how to narrow it down except to say that.
Well, I mean, let me just focus on one aspect of it, which is the U.S.'s role, as you mentioned, in buying bonds.
Yes,
And so let me just remind of recent history. You know, I don't 19th century history. I pretty much always have to cede over to Professor Johnson, but except I came prepped for the 14th Amendment today, so good for me. If you go back to 1994, we issued let me go back a little further. In the 1930s, we created an exchange rate stabilization fund. Roosevelt did to bolster the U.S. dollar when we went off gold in the 30s. Okay, and so that, guess what? That money just laid around. Robert Rubin in 1994 decides to raid that money because he finds out that the Mexican peso is in huge trouble, and because they're our new trading partner with a new free trade agreement between our two countries and Canada, he gets $150 billion and says, yeah, we'll lend it to you. Okay, so, and you know, there's actually no constitutional reason that he's allowed to do that, but he can. And he does, and now we've found ourselves periodically supporting debt in places like Greece and Ireland, and in places like Argentina, which we did in 2000. We supported him at that time, and so we now have this new role. And I would point out really that it's just fairly new, and it's not clear how constitutional that really is.
And it's I don't mean to. Were you done?
Yeah, I am.
My hearing's not so good. This is something, though, that again comes back to history and that concerns me, because one of the things that happened in the transition from the period before World War I to the period after World War I was that the British had traditionally played that role in the 19th century, and the Americans refused to start doing it in the 1920s, and now we're doing it. If we don't do it, who will? I mean, it may not be constitutional, but we're doing it. And now if we step back and say we can't do it for whatever reason, who's going to pick up the baton? And that's just a question. I don't have an answer. I don't know. I heard a story on Marketplace, I think it was, that the British said we would be happy to have the RMB operate as an offshore currency in London, which startled the heck out of me, because it's like, wow, we have euro dollars. Are we going to have euro RMBs now in banks?
RMB is Chinese currency.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Renminbi.
That would be remarkable.
There's another question.
I think Professor Banyan, you mentioned that back in the 70s we had a debt that reached $5 trillion, and there were people freaking out about it. And now, 40 years later, we have a debt that's reached 15 trillion or whatever it is. What exactly, and I mean, it seems like our country is still operating pretty normally. What exactly, is this something that's secretly sustainable? We secretly can have a bunch of debt? Or what exactly is like the limit, I guess?
Well, there was a debate that started a few years ago when Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart published this book called This Time It's Different. I would assume that Lewis has taught from that book here, or at least introduced it to a classroom, because it's 700 years of history, of financial history. And I would think, I haven't taught from it, but I've read it, I've talked about it with some people, and there's been some controversy over the results that have been in it. But to step aside from that, there's this concern that there's some threshold over which if you print debt beyond that level, all of a sudden something really bad happens. It's a discontinuity, okay, of some kind, which actually Rogoff and Reinhardt didn't actually say, but was interpreted by some to mean that. Okay, but I think a fair reading of what they said was that's not true. But I think the concern is that we do know that when financial markets move, they can sometimes move very fast. The price changes can be dramatic, and they can be very disruptive. And so I think there's just that fear that's out there. Have we reached that point? I don't think Rogoff and Reinhardt think so. I certainly don't think so. Is it around the corner? I believe it's continuous. I believe we're reaching the point where those costs increase. But, you know, without getting into some deep philosophical discussion of black swans, which I'm going to avoid because it's dangerous. I will just say I mean, we can sustain this, but remember, the minute somebody thinks you possibly might not pay them back, lots of bad things begin to happen to you in financial markets, and you have no idea where that point is. An ounce of prevention is probably worth more than a pound of cure.
And just to follow on that financial markets operate so quickly today. I mean, they collapsed really rapidly when we were connected with copper wires and telephones and telegraph. Now, with fiber optic cable and the internet, you know, how fast could something happen? But I think your point about Reinhardt and Rogoff is right on the nose. They argue that we don't know where that spot is, but there is some spot. And it's worth being cautious about that. And it comes back to something that I think as economists, we always start our classes with in introductory economics, which is there are opportunity costs. So if governments are issuing debt, okay, maybe there's not some cliff that we're going to go off, but every dollar of debt that the government issues is a dollar that could have been used for something else other than what the government used it for. What's the opportunity cost of that? Well, if you've got lots of unemployment, there are economists who'd argue, well, the opportunity cost is very low. Nobody would be spending it anyway. The government should spend it and build bridges or bury it in the middle of the British Midlands, as Keynes argued, and have other people dig it up. He said you should bury banknotes in bottles and hire people to dig them up, and that would be a good way to stimulate employment. It was a joke, but he did say it. But is that, over long stretches of time, that isn't a very good assumption about the way the world works. I think a better assumption is that resources are fairly well employed and that there is what sometimes is called a crowding out effect of debt, that if you issue a dollar's worth of public debt, there's a dollar's worth of private capital formation that doesn't get done. And the bigger that the national debt gets relative to the size of the economy, the more I think that friction starts to come into play. That's where I worry about the debt. You know, why it's a problem, and we don't know where that spot is, which makes it doubly scary for me.
So, kind of bring this conversation back in here, in the pub here. College students, and I think most of us are about 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever we do, we're gonna be getting jobs, trying to be employed. One, what's that going to look like? What's the economy going to look like in the future here? And you also talked about, you know, raising the Social Security age, and that's been a common debate we've been having, maybe, and we should have. For living longer, we do have this debt that's increasing. In your opinions, what's the projection going to be now, and then when we are close to retirement?
Well, I wish I could give you a precise answer. Economists are really bad at predicting, especially about the future. It's a joke. But yeah, exactly. But I've had this transition, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but I used to look out at students and think of myself. And now I look out at students and I think of you as my children. Not literally, obviously, but you know, my daughter's a first-year student, yours is a second, and I think about that question from the perspective of, well, what's my daughter's life and my son's life? What is it going to look like? The big thing that I've been keeping an eye on is what economists call productivity. The amount of output we can produce per unit of either workers measured as hours, or if you want to get really fancy, something we call total factor productivity, output relative to all the inputs. That gives me reason to be optimistic. I see total factor productivity as doing pretty well over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, it's like the debt ratio. Maybe it's going to fall off a cliff and I don't see it, but with the technological advances that are going on, especially in the melding of computer, semiconductor technology, and biology, I see some really amazing things that could happen. Now, it has costs, extended life, and things like that, but I'm actually quite optimistic when I think about that. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Wow, we're finally going to disagree. I'm not as optimistic as Lewis is. I worry about what my children, my daughter's 19 and a sophomore here at St. Ben's, and my son is going to turn 30 next spring. And he works 3 jobs, and he has a 2-year degree. And I worry what he's going to be able to do 20, 30, 40 years from now, because I tell him, I said, don't plan on retiring before you're 70, because that won't be there. And in terms of the technical term that Lewis used, total factor productivity, I mean, there are ways we increase the ability. We can increase how much you can earn by giving you more education. Well, guess what? We got a very well-educated workforce. We've hit diminishing returns on that. We can give you each more capital to work with. We call it capital deepening in economics. We got a lot of capital per person in this country. You got almost $80,000 per person if you look at the international numbers. That's really high. That's a lot. I'm not sure we're going to get more of that. So you come back to what Lewis called total factor productivity, and there, I guess I've been reading. You may have read the Robert Gordon piece earlier this year that was in a popular magazine. It wasn't actually, although I know he wrote it originally as a professional paper, in which he's pretty pessimistic about where we're going. He's very pessimistic, and I just finished Tyler Cowen's Average is Over. Which
I haven't read
which
that
you
yet.
should, which I know you'll
Yeah.
read. I know you're going to read it.
Yeah,
I actually
I haven't
finished
read
it,
that
and it's pretty pessimistic too.
Yeah,
And it may just be a short-term thing. Okay, so when I say I'm pessimistic about 5 to 10 years, and I try to think about what's the next great. If IT has been the great technological change of the last 25 years, what's the next one going to be? And I come back to that life-extending technology, and I think of particular because I am older, and guess what? Guys like me who get old, who are a little heavy set, I have type 2 diabetes. So do a lot of people, a lot of my friends, and a lot of us try to fight it that way. And someone who figures out how to beat diabetes is going to have something that's going to make a major change in this country. That's what that's going to look like. It's not going to be making the iPhone 6. Okay, and it's not going to, I know, feel bad about that, or that wicked super cool tablet that you can press a button in and all of a sudden it spits out a pizza. That's not going to be it. I mean, what really is going to change technology is something you can't really see yet, and I don't see us being close to that point right now. But you know what? What's great about the world is it's full of surprises. And I'll be happy to be proven wrong and be surprised by that next technology. I guess I'm inclined, based on Gordon and Cowan, I'm inclined, maybe I should read more cheery stuff because I'm not so cheery right this moment.
With that, we have reached the end of our Politics in a Pint. Again, we'd like to thank Professors Banyan and Johnson for joining us. So we have a commemorative Politics in a Pint glass for you to put whatever you're...
coveted.
Yeah, exactly. A pint of whatever you would like in it.
Thank you.
So again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to all the students for joining us. The next McCarthy Center event, we don't have a lot going on over the next month, but our next Politics in a Pint will be Thursday, November 7th in here, and we hope to see you then. Have a good night.